Nothing says, "Welcome home," like your own suitcase sitting on the porch like a rejected door-to-door salesman. I stood there in the October chill, keys still jingling in my hand, staring at the navy blue Samsonite that had been my grandfather's, the same one I'd used for our honeymoon to Bar Harbor 5 years ago. The porch light flickered on, and there she was, Jenna, my wife of 7 years, standing in the doorway like some sort of domestic security guard. Her arms were crossed, her blonde hair pulled back in that severe ponytail she wore when she meant business. Behind her, lurking like a vulture in designer jeans, was Tanya. "Eli," Jenna said, her voice flat as yesterday's soda. "We need to talk." I picked up the suitcase, testing its weight. Heavy. Someone had packed it thoroughly. "Apparently not," I said, keeping my voice level. "Seems like you've already had the conversation without me." Tanya stepped forward, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Come on, Eli. You were planning to leave anyway. We all know it." That was news to me. I'd spent the last 3 months fixing the basement workshop, installing new shelving, and planning to refinish the hardwood floors upstairs. But apparently, in Tanya's twisted little universe, home improvement was code for abandonment. "Is that right?" I asked, looking past Tanya to my wife. "And what exactly makes you think I was planning to leave?" Jenna's jaw tightened. "I know about your secret savings account, Eli, and all those late nights, the lies." Secret savings account. I almost laughed. The emergency fund I'd been building to surprise her with a kitchen renovation. The late nights she was talking about were overtime shifts at Henderson Construction, trying to sock away enough money to afford the granite countertops she'd been hinting about for months. But explaining that would require Jenna to actually listen, and judging by the way Tanya was whispering in her ear like some sort of poisonous fairy godmother, listening wasn't on tonight's agenda. "I see," I said. I reached into my wallet and pulled out $300 in 20s, emergency cash I kept for job site expenses. "Here's some money to cover utilities this month. I wouldn't want you to be inconvenienced." I held out the bills to Jenna. She stared at them like they might bite her. "That's it?" Tanya screeched. "That's all you're going to say?" I looked at her, really looked at her. 28 years old and already showing the hard edges that came from a lifetime of taking shortcuts and burning bridges. She'd been living in our guest room for 6 weeks, ever since her latest boyfriend had thrown her out for stealing his credit cards. 6 weeks of dirty dishes left in the sink, wet towels on the bathroom floor, and my beer disappearing from the refrigerator. "What would you like me to say, Tanya? How about an apology? How about admitting what you've been doing?" The funny thing was, I genuinely had no idea what I was supposed to have been doing. But I'd learned long ago that trying to prove a negative to someone determined to believe the worst was like trying to nail water to a tree. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. Just not in the way they thought. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. Jenna took the money, her fingers cold when they brushed mine. For just a second, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Doubt, maybe, or regret. But then Tanya's hand landed on her shoulder, and whatever I'd seen vanished. "You should go," Jenna said quietly. I nodded, picked up my suitcase, and walked to my truck. As I loaded the Samsonite into the bed, I could hear them talking on the porch. Their voices carried in the crisp air. "You did the right thing," Tanya was saying. "He was never good enough for you anyway." "I know, but nothing. Trust me, Jenna. You're better off without him." I climbed into the cab and sat there for a moment, letting the engine warm up. Through the windshield, I could see them silhouetted in the doorway. Jenna looked small next to her sister, uncertain. Tanya looked triumphant. As I backed out of the driveway, I caught a glimpse of Mrs. Dwyer's face in her kitchen window next door. The old woman had been watching the whole thing, probably taking mental notes for tomorrow's gossip session at the post office. I drove slowly down Orchard Lane, past the neat little houses with their matching mailboxes and carefully maintained lawns. At the stop sign, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Jimmy's number. Eli? His voice was thick with sleep. It's almost midnight, man. What's wrong? I need a place to crash tonight and maybe a beer. Door's open. I'll put the coffee on. Jimmy lived above the Rusty Anchor, the bar he managed on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, 2 rooms and a bathroom that had seen better decades, but it was quiet, and it was away from Orchard Lane. As I drove through the empty streets, I found myself thinking about the workshop in the basement, all those hours I'd spent down there, building shelves and organizing tools. I'd been planning to surprise Jenna with a craft room in the corner, complete with a sewing station and storage for her quilting supplies. Surprise. I parked behind the Anchor and climbed the narrow stairs to Jimmy's apartment. He was waiting in the doorway, a steaming mug in each hand. Rough night? He asked. Getting better by the minute, I said, and realized I meant it. We sat at his kitchen table, drinking coffee that could strip paint and listening to the old building settle around us. Jimmy didn't ask questions, which was one of the reasons we'd been friends since high school. He just waited. Jenna threw me out, I said finally. Her idea or Tanya's? Does it matter? Jimmy considered this. Probably not, but I'm guessing Tanya had something to do with it. I told him about the secret savings account accusation, the late nights, the suitcase on the porch. Jimmy listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or shaking his head. So what's your next move? He asked when I finished. I stared into my coffee mug, watching the steam curl up toward the ceiling. I'm going to find myself a place to live, something small, maybe month to month, while I figure things out. And then? Then I'm going to find out what's really going on. Jimmy raised an eyebrow. You think there's more to this? There's always more, Jimmy. People don't just wake up one morning and decide to throw their husband out based on a savings account they helped him open. We talked for another hour, but my mind was already elsewhere. I was thinking about the way Jenna couldn't meet my eyes when she took the money, the way Tanya had seemed so prepared, so ready with her explanations and accusations. Most of all, I was thinking about the workshop in the basement and all the things I'd left down there, tools, supplies, and a small fireproof safe hidden behind the water heater, a safe that contained the deed to the house, our insurance policies, and about $12,000 in cash that Jenna didn't know about. Real emergency money, the kind that might be useful if, say, someone was planning to disappear. I finished my coffee and stood up. Thanks, Jimmy. I owe you one. You don't owe me anything, but Eli? He looked up at me, his expression serious. Be careful. Whatever's going on, don't do anything stupid. I smiled for the first time all evening. Don't worry, I'm done being stupid. As I settled onto Jimmy's couch, pulling a scratchy wool blanket up to my chin, I could hear the wind picking up outside. October in Maine, with winter coming on fast. But inside, I felt warm for the first time in weeks. Tomorrow, I'd start looking for answers. Tonight, I'd sleep better than I had in months. The Pineview apartments weren't much to look at, a cluster of 2-story buildings that had been painted beige sometime during the Carter administration. But the rent was reasonable, utilities included, and the manager didn't ask too many questions when I paid the first month in cash. Unit 2B, she said, handing me a key that looked like it had been cut with a butter knife. Laundry's in the basement. No loud music after 10. The apartment was exactly what I'd expected, small, generic, and smelling faintly of the previous tenant's cooking experiments. 1 bedroom, a kitchenette with appliances from the Reagan era, and a living room barely big enough for a couch and television. The carpet was industrial brown, chosen specifically to hide stains and disappointment. I set my suitcase on the bed and looked around. This was my life now. 40 square feet of freedom. My phone buzzed. A text from Jenna. Did you take the spare key to the house? I typed back. No. Why would I need it? 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, just wondering. Right. I spent the morning at Walmart, buying the essentials, coffee, instant soup, a decent pillow, and a prepaid phone, the kind that couldn't be tracked or monitored. Old habits from my paramedic days, when I'd learned that information was the difference between life and everything else. By noon, I was parked across the street from Henderson Construction, waiting for my boss to get back from lunch. Mike Henderson was a good guy, the kind who'd give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. He was also practical enough to understand when a man's personal life required some flexibility. Eli! He climbed out of his pickup, wiping barbecue sauce from his fingers with a paper napkin. Wasn't expecting to see you today. I need to talk to you about my schedule. We went into his office, a cluttered space that smelled like sawdust and coffee. Mike poured himself a cup from the pot that had been brewing since dawn and offered me one. I accepted gratefully. What's on your mind? I gave him the short version, separated from my wife, needed some extra work to cover additional expenses. Mike listened, nodding occasionally. I can put you on the Riverside project, he said. Commercial renovation, lots of overtime if you want it. Pays time and a half after 40 hours. That would be perfect. Good. Start Monday. And Eli? He looked at me over his coffee mug. I've been through a divorce. If you need to talk, or if you need an advance on your pay, just ask. I thanked him and left, feeling better about my immediate future. Work was good. Work was normal. Work was something I could control. The rusty anchor was nearly empty when I arrived that afternoon. Just a couple of regulars nursing beers and watching a baseball game on the television above the bar. Jimmy was restocking bottles, moving with the efficient grace of someone who'd been doing the job for years. How's the new place? He asked. Luxurious. You should see the view of the dumpster. He laughed and pulled me a beer. It's temporary. Everything's temporary. I took a sip and let the cold liquid wash away the taste of instant coffee. What do you know about Craig Jeffries? Jimmy's hand paused on the bottle he was shelving. CJ? Why? Just curious. He still work at the factory? Floor supervisor now. Got promoted last year. Jimmy's voice was carefully neutral. Why are you asking about CJ? I shrugged. His name came up somewhere. Can't remember where. It was a lie, but a necessary one. CJ's name had come up in my memory, specifically the memory of seeing his pickup truck parked outside the factory when I'd driven past last week. Parked next to a familiar silver Honda Civic, Jenna's car. He's married, Jimmy said quietly. I know. Kids too, 2 of them. Uh-huh. Jimmy set down the bottle and looked at me directly. Eli, whatever you're thinking, I'm not thinking anything, just making conversation. But I was thinking plenty. I was thinking about how CJ and Jenna had gone to high school together, how they'd dated briefly senior year before she'd met me, how he'd been at our wedding, standing in the back with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. I was thinking about late nights when Jenna claimed to be working on quarterly reports, and how she'd started paying more attention to her appearance lately. New clothes, expensive perfume, trips to the salon that she'd charged to our joint credit card. Most of all, I was thinking about the way she'd looked at me when she handed me that suitcase. Not angry, not hurt, guilty. I finished my beer and left Jimmy to his work. The sun was setting as I drove back toward Orchard Lane, not to go home. I didn't have a home there anymore, but to see what there was to see. Mrs. Dwyer was in her front yard, raking leaves with the methodical precision of someone who had nowhere else to be. She looked up as I drove past, her eyes following my truck with undisguised curiosity. I parked 2 blocks away and walked back, staying in the shadows of the maple trees that lined the street. The house looked the same as always, White clapboard siding, blue shutters, the front porch I'd rebuilt 2 summers ago. Light glowed warm and yellow in the kitchen window. Through that window I could see Jenna moving around, preparing dinner for 1, or maybe 2. It was hard to tell from this distance. She was wearing the red sweater I'd bought her for Christmas, the one she claimed made her look fat. As I watched, she picked up her phone and made a call. Even from across the street, I could see her smile as whoever answered picked up. She laughed at something, touched her hair, turned away from the window. I'd seen that gesture before. The hair touch, the turned shoulder. It was what she did when she was flirting. A car turned onto Orchard Lane, headlights sweeping across the neat lawns and tidy driveways. I stepped deeper into the shadows, but I needn't have bothered. The driver was focused on the house, not on random pedestrians. CJ's pickup truck, distinctive enough with its lifted suspension and oversized tires. He parked in my driveway like he belonged there. Through the kitchen window, I saw Jenna end her call and move toward the front door. A moment later, she appeared on the porch, no longer wearing the red sweater. She'd changed into something else, something that looked suspiciously like the black dress she'd worn on our anniversary last year. They embraced on the porch, not like old friends, but like lovers who'd been separated too long. Then they disappeared inside and the porch light went out. I stood there in the darkness, watching the warm glow of my former home, and felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. Not heartbreak, I'd expected this on some level, but something harder and more useful. Clarity. I walked back to my truck, started the engine, and drove to the 24-hour diner on Route 1. I ordered coffee and pie and sat in the corner booth, thinking. Jenna wanted me gone, but she didn't want a divorce. Not yet. A divorce would mean splitting assets, including the house. It would mean lawyers and paperwork and uncomfortable questions about where the money had gone. Much easier to simply push me out, make me the bad guy, and then claim abandonment when the time came to make it official. But there were problems with that plan. Problems they hadn't considered. The house was in both our names, but I'd paid the down payment with money from my grandfather's estate. I had the paperwork to prove it. The emergency fund they thought was secret? I had photographs of every deposit, every withdrawal, every transaction. Most importantly, I had time. Time to watch, to learn, to understand exactly what they were planning. I finished my pie and drove back to the Pineview apartments, where my new life was waiting in all its beige glory. Tomorrow, I'd start the Riverside project. I'd work overtime, save money, and begin building a case. Tonight, I'd sleep well, knowing that for the first time in months, I understood exactly where I stood. And it wasn't nearly as bad as they thought. The Riverside project was a godsend. 60 hours a week renovating a 3-story office building, turning outdated spaces into modern apartments. Hard work that left me too tired to think about anything except sleep. The overtime pay was building my new emergency fund faster than I'd expected, but the best part was the flexibility. Mike didn't care when I showed up, as long as I put in my hours and got the work done, which meant I could adjust my schedule as needed. Like this Thursday morning, when I parked across from Pinnacle Manufacturing at 7:30 and waited. Jenna's Honda appeared at 7:45, followed 3 minutes later by CJ's pickup. They parked in different sections of the lot, maintaining the illusion of coincidence. But I watched them walk toward the building, saw the way they carefully didn't look at each other, didn't acknowledge each other's presence. The kind of careful distance that screamed guilt. I followed them inside, nodding to the security guard who recognized me from my paramedic days. The factory had called us out here plenty of times. Industrial accidents, heart attacks, the occasional overdose in the parking lot. Eli Crane, the guard said, checking his clipboard. You're not on the visitor list. Just dropping off some paperwork for HR, I said, holding up a manila envelope. Inside was my resume and a job application I'd printed off their website. Not entirely a lie. The HR department was on the second floor, overlooking the factory floor. Through the glass windows, I could see CJ talking to a group of workers near the stamping machines. He gestured with his hands, explaining something, playing the part of the competent supervisor. "Can I help you?" The receptionist was young, probably fresh out of college, with the kind of eager smile that hadn't been worn down by years of corporate politics. "I'd like to submit an application," I said, handing her the envelope. "Is there someone I could speak with about opportunities in maintenance?" "Let me check." She picked up her phone and made a quick call. "Mrs. Crane can see you in a few minutes." Mrs. Crane. My wife, who had no idea her husband was sitting in her waiting area. I almost laughed. Instead, I thanked the receptionist and took a seat, picking up a copy of Industry Weekly and pretending to read an article about supply chain management. 5 minutes later, Jenna appeared in the doorway of her office. She was wearing a navy blue suit I'd never seen before, her hair styled in a way that made her look older, more professional, more expensive. She saw me and froze. "Eli, what are you doing here?" I stood up, smiled pleasantly. "Job hunting. I heard you might have some openings in maintenance." The receptionist looked between us, confused. "Do you two know each other?" "We've met," I said before Jenna could answer. "Small town, you know how it is." Jenna's face had gone pale, but she recovered quickly. "Of course. Why don't you come into my office, Mr. Crane?" Her office was larger than I'd expected, with a view of the parking lot and a desk that looked like it cost more than my monthly rent. Certificates and awards covered one wall. Employee of the Month, safety recognition, a plaque commemorating her promotion to senior HR manager. She closed the door and turned to face me, her professional mask slipping. "What do you want?" "I told you, I'm looking for work." "Cut the act, Eli. Why are you really here?" I sat down in the chair across from her desk, making myself comfortable. "Mike Henderson's project is winding down. I need something steady." "You can't work here." "Why not? I'm qualified. Clean background check, good references, experience in industrial settings." I leaned forward slightly. "Unless there's some other reason you don't want me around." She sat down heavily, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for her coffee mug. "This is inappropriate." "What's inappropriate? A man applying for a job?" "You know what I mean." "Actually, I don't. We're separated, not divorced. There's no legal reason I can't work here." I paused, letting that sink in. "Unless you think it might be awkward having me around. Uncomfortable, maybe." Through the window, I could see CJ crossing the parking lot, heading for the building, right on schedule for his 10 o'clock break. Jenna followed my gaze and saw him too. Her jaw tightened. "I can't hire you," she said finally. "Can't or won't?" "Both." I stood up, straightening my jacket. "That's fine. I understand completely. Thanks for your time, Mrs. Crane." I walked to the door, then paused with my hand on the handle. "Oh, and Jenna? Nice office. The view's fantastic." I left her sitting there and walked back through the reception area, nodding goodbye to the young woman behind the desk. In the elevator, I checked my watch. Perfect timing. CJ was just entering the building as I reached the lobby. He saw me and stopped, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been panic. "Eli, what are you doing here?" "Job interview," I said cheerfully. "Small world, right? I had no idea you worked here." "Yeah, well," he shifted uncomfortably. "How'd it go?" "Not great. Apparently they're not hiring right now." I shrugged. Win some, lose some. I walked past him toward the exit, then stopped and turned back. "Hey, CJ, say hello to Linda for me. How are the kids doing?" His wife's name hit him like a slap. "They're fine. Good. That's great. Family's important, you know. You've got to protect what matters most." I left him standing there and drove back to the Riverside project, where I spent the rest of the day installing drywall and thinking about the look on Jenna's face when she'd seen CJ in the parking lot. Fear, guilt, and something else. Calculation. That evening, I stopped by the Rusty Anchor. Jimmy was training a new bartender, a college kid who looked like he'd never seen a beer tap before. "Busy night?" I asked. "Getting there. Thursdays are picking up now that the weather's turning cold." Jimmy pulled me a beer and set it on the bar. "How's the new job?" "Good. Steady work, decent pay." I took a sip. "I ran into CJ today." Jimmy's expression didn't change, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "Yeah? Where?" "The factory. I was dropping off a job application." "You thinking about leaving Henderson?" "Just exploring options." I watched the college kid fumble with a bottle opener. CJ seemed nervous about something, jumpy. Maybe he's got reason to be. I looked at Jimmy directly. "What do you know?" He glanced around the bar, making sure no one was listening. "Nothing concrete, but there's been talk." "What kind of talk?" "The kind that ruins marriages." I nodded, unsurprised. In a town this size, secrets had a shelf life measured in days, not months. Someone had seen something, heard something, put two and two together. "How long has the talk been going around?" "Month, maybe 2. Started when people noticed CJ's truck parked in unusual places." "Like where?" Jimmy hesitated. "Like Orchard Lane." I finished my beer and left a generous tip. The pieces were falling into place, creating a picture that was both clearer and more complicated than I'd expected. Jenna and CJ were having an affair. That much was obvious. But they were also being sloppy about it, which suggested either desperation or arrogance. Maybe both. The question was, what did they plan to do about it? I drove back to my apartment, where I spent the evening on my laptop, researching Maine's divorce laws, community property, asset division, grounds for dissolution of marriage. Interesting reading, especially the parts about adultery and abandonment. I'd been living at the Pineview apartments for 3 weeks when I decided to take a closer look at my sister-in-law's daily routine. Tanya had always been a creature of habit, and habits could be useful things to understand. She left the house every Tuesday and Thursday at 10:30, driving Jenna's old Corolla to what I assumed were job interviews or errands. But job interviews didn't usually involve multiple stops at pawn shops and second-hand stores. I followed her at a distance, staying 2 or 3 cars back, using the surveillance techniques I'd learned during my paramedic training. People notice patterns, but they rarely notice the background noise of traffic. Her first stop was Murphy's Pawn on Industrial Street. She went in carrying a small canvas bag and came out empty-handed, tucking what looked like cash into her jacket pocket. Second stop, another pawn shop across town. Same routine. Third stop, a consignment store that specialized in jewelry and antiques. I parked where I could see the entrance and waited. When she came out, I followed her to a coffee shop, where she sat at an outdoor table and made several phone calls. Even from across the street, I could see she was agitated about something. That evening, I called my mother. "Eli, honey, how are you holding up?" Maggie Crane had never been one to sugarcoat things, and she wasn't about to start now. "I heard about you and Jenna." Word travels fast. Faster when Mrs. Dwyer calls to tell me she saw you get thrown out with a suitcase. There was a pause. "Want to tell me what really happened?" I gave her the basic story, leaving out my suspicions about CJ and my surveillance of Tanya. Mom listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of disapproval. "That girl was always trouble," she said when I finished. "Tanya, I mean. Remember when she stole money from my purse at your wedding reception?" Actually, I didn't remember that. "She did what?" $40 from my purse while I was dancing with your father. I saw her do it, but Jenna begged me not to make a scene." Mom's voice carried the weight of old frustration. Said it would ruin the day. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you were happy, and I didn't want to start your marriage with family drama. Maybe I should have." We talked for another 20 minutes, catching up on family news and local gossip. But my mind kept returning to that wedding reception 7 years ago, and the pattern of behavior it represented. After I hung up, I sat in my small living room, staring at the water stain on the ceiling and thinking about patterns. Tanya's pattern of taking things that didn't belong to her. Jenna's pattern of covering for her sister. My pattern of looking the other way to keep the peace. Patterns could be broken. The next morning, I drove to the house early, parking where I could see the driveway, but remain hidden behind Mrs. Dwyer's hedge. At 8:15, Jenna left for work in her Honda. At 8:45, CJ's pickup appeared, but instead of parking in the driveway, he continued past and turned into the alley behind the house. Smart. Mrs. Dwyer couldn't see the back door from her kitchen window. At 10:30, right on schedule, Tanya emerged from the house carrying her canvas bag, but instead of getting into the Corolla, she walked to CJ's truck and climbed into the passenger seat. Interesting. I followed them to a pawn shop I hadn't seen before, one in the sketchy part of town where people minded their own business and didn't ask too many questions. Tanya went inside while CJ waited in the truck. When she came out, they drove to a small apartment complex on the east side of town. CJ parked, and they both got out. Tanya kissed him on the cheek, not romantically, but like family, before disappearing into one of the buildings. CJ drove away, leaving her there. I waited 5 minutes, then walked to the building's entrance. The mailboxes in the lobby told me what I needed to know. S. Morrison, apartment 3B. Shane Morrison, Tanya's boyfriend, the ex-con she'd been dating before she moved in with us. I drove back to the Riverside project, but my mind wasn't on drywall and electrical work. It was on the implications of what I'd seen. Tanya wasn't just pawning her own belongings. She was pawning items from the house, my house, and using CJ to transport her and the stolen goods, which meant CJ was involved in more than just an affair. He was an accessory to theft. That evening, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a private investigator I'd known during my paramedic days, a former cop who specialized in insurance fraud and domestic cases. "Tommy, it's Eli Crane. I need some help." "Eli, how's civilian life treating you?" "Like a root canal. Listen, I need some surveillance work done. Discreet, professional, and well documented." "What kind of surveillance?" I told him about Tanya's pawn shop visits and CJ's involvement. Tommy listened like the professional he was, asking pointed questions about times, locations, and what kind of evidence I was looking for. "I can do it," he said finally, "but it won't be cheap." "How much?" $500 a day plus expenses, and I'll need at least a week to build a solid case. I had the money, thanks to the overtime at Riverside. "Do it." The second call was to the house. Jenna answered on the 3rd ring, her voice cautious. "Eli? Is something wrong?" "I need to pick up some of my tools from the basement. Would this weekend work?" There was a long pause. "I don't think that's a good idea." "They're my tools, Jenna. I need them for work. Can't you buy new ones?" "Sure, if I had an extra $3,000 lying around." I kept my voice reasonable, patient. "I'm not asking to move back in, just 30 minutes to get my equipment." Another pause. I could hear her breathing, thinking. "Saturday morning," she said finally. 9 o'clock, and I want Tanya here when you come." "That's fine. Just get your tools and leave." Of course. But I had no intention of limiting myself to tools. Saturday morning would be an opportunity to see what else might be missing from the house, and maybe to plant a few seeds of doubt about her sister's activities. I spent Friday evening making a list of everything I'd left in the basement workshop. Tools, supplies, equipment, and a few items that Jenna didn't know about. Like the small digital recorder I'd hidden behind the water heater, voice-activated and capable of recording for hours. If Tanya and CJ had been using the house for their planning sessions, there might be something interesting on that device. Saturday morning arrived cold and gray, with the kind of drizzle that made everything look washed out and depressing. Perfect weather for a confrontation. I pulled into the driveway at exactly 9 o'clock, noting that the Corolla was parked where my truck used to sit. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Jenna opened the door before I could knock, her face set in neutral lines. She was wearing jeans and an old sweater, weekend clothes that made her look younger and more vulnerable than her work attire. 30 minutes, she said without preamble. Where's Tanya? Still sleeping. So much for wanting her present during my visit. But that was fine. It would make things easier. The basement looked exactly as I'd left it, except for the empty spaces where several expensive tools should have been. My cordless drill set, gone. The pneumatic nailer I'd bought last year, gone. A box of specialty bits and attachments, gone. Jenna, I called up the stairs. Did you move any of my tools? No, why? Some things are missing. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, then she appeared in the workshop looking around with what appeared to be genuine confusion. What's missing? I pointed to the empty spaces, describing what should have been there. With each item I named, her frown deepened. I didn't touch anything, she said. Maybe you took them when you moved out? I only took what was in my suitcase. These were down here. We looked at each other, both understanding the implications, but neither wanting to say it out loud. Maybe Tanya borrowed them, Jenna said finally, her voice small. Maybe. I continued loading my remaining tools into boxes, making mental notes about what was missing. The total value was probably close to $800. Not enough to file an insurance claim, but enough to matter. While Jenna watched, I retrieved the digital recorder from its hiding place behind the water heater. She didn't see me pocket the small device, but she noticed me checking the area. What are you looking for? Nothing important, just making sure I didn't leave anything valuable. As I carried the last box upstairs, I heard movement from the guest room. Tanya's voice, muffled but audible, talking to someone on the phone. Told you it would work. No, he doesn't suspect anything. Tuesday, same as always. Jenna heard it too. Her face went pale. I should go, I said, setting the box by the front door. Eli, wait. She caught my arm as I reached for the door handle. About the tools. If Tanya took them, I'll make sure you get them back. I looked down at her hand on my arm, then up at her face. For a moment, she looked like the woman I'd married, uncertain and apologetic and trying to do the right thing. Don't worry about it, I said gently. They're just tools. But they weren't just tools, and we both knew it. They were evidence of a pattern, proof that the person she'd chosen to trust over her husband was exactly what I'd always said she was. A thief. I drove away from Orchard Lane with my tools, my recorder, and a plan that was finally beginning to take shape. Tommy's surveillance report arrived on a Wednesday, delivered to my apartment in a manila envelope thick with photographs and documentation. I spread the contents across my small kitchen table and felt something cold and satisfied settle in my chest. Tanya, caught in the act at 4 different pawn shops over the course of a week. CJ, photographed driving her to and from locations, clearly aware of what she was doing. Timestamps, receipts, even audio recordings of conversations in the parking lots. But the most interesting discovery was the last page of the report. A copy of a lease agreement for an apartment in Portland, signed by both Tanya Morrison and Craig Jeffries. They weren't just stealing from me, they were planning to disappear together. I called Tommy that evening. Nice work, I said. This is exactly what I needed. There's more, he said. Your sister-in-law's boyfriend, Shane? He's been asking around about your wife's work schedule, what kind of security the factory has, whether she ever brings work home. What kind of work would he be interested in? The kind that involves employee records, payroll information, maybe access codes for the building. Tommy paused. Your wife's in HR, right? She'd have access to a lot of sensitive information. The pieces clicked into place with an almost audible snap. This wasn't just about a simple affair and some petty theft. They were planning something bigger. Tommy, I need you to do one more thing. Name it. Find out everything you can about Shane Morrison's criminal history, and see if you can get a look at the apartment CJ and Tanya rented. I want to know what they're planning. That's going to cost extra. Do it. I hung up and stared at the photograph spread across my table. Tanya, smiling as she pocketed cash from stolen goods. CJ, checking his watch like a man with a schedule to keep. Both of them so confident, so sure they were smarter than everyone around them. They had no idea what was coming. The Orchard Lane block party was an annual tradition, held every year on the last Saturday of October. Neighbors gathered in the street, sharing food and gossip while children ran around in Halloween costumes. Mrs. Dwyer always organized it, turning it into a combination social event and intelligence-gathering operation. This year, I decided to attend. I spent Friday evening preparing, printing copies of Tommy's photographs and surveillance report. I also made several phone calls, including one to the Portland Police Department's Fraud Division and another to the security office at Pinnacle Manufacturing. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crisp blue sky that made everything look sharp and clean. Perfect weather for a reckoning. I arrived at Orchard Lane just as the party was getting started, carrying a covered dish and wearing my best smile. Mrs. Dwyer spotted me immediately. "Eli, what a surprise! I wasn't sure you'd come." "Wouldn't miss it," I said, handing her the casserole. "How have you been, Mrs. Dwyer?" "Oh, keeping busy, keeping my eyes open." She glanced toward my former house, where Jenna was setting up a folding table on the front lawn. "Things have been interesting around here lately." "I bet they have." We talked for a few minutes, Mrs. Dwyer filling me in on neighborhood gossip with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been saving up stories for weeks. I listened, nodded, and watched the party develop around us. Jenna saw me eventually, her face cycling through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been panic. She was wearing a yellow sundress I'd never seen before, her hair styled in loose curls that caught the sunlight. She looked beautiful, and guilty, and scared. "Eli," she said, approaching cautiously, "I didn't expect to see you here." "Mrs. Dwyer invited me. I hope that's okay." "Of course, it's just—" She glanced back at the house, where I could see Tanya moving around in the kitchen. "Maybe this isn't the best time." "For what?" "For whatever you're planning." I smiled, the expression feeling strange on my face. "I'm not planning anything, Jenna. I'm just here for the party." But that was a lie, and she knew it. She could see it in my eyes, the same way I could see the fear in hers. "Where's CJ?" I asked casually. "I thought he might be here." Her face went white. "Why would CJ be here?" "No reason, just figured he might enjoy the party. He always seemed like a social guy." Before she could respond, a familiar pickup truck turned onto Orchard Lane. CJ, arriving right on schedule, just like I'd hoped he would. He parked across the street and climbed out, scanning the crowd until he spotted Jenna. Even from a distance, I could see the moment he noticed me. His whole body went rigid. "Excuse me," Jenna said, and hurried toward him. I watched them have what appeared to be an urgent conversation, both of them glancing in my direction. Finally, CJ nodded and walked over to where I was standing. "Eli," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Good to see you." "You too, CJ. How's the family?" "They're fine." He shifted uncomfortably. "Listen, about the other day at the factory. Don't worry about it. Water under the bridge." But it wasn't, and he knew it. I could see the sweat on his forehead despite the cool air. The party continued around us, neighbors chatting and children playing, everyone pretending not to notice the tension between the three of us. Mrs. Dwyer moved through the crowd like a social butterfly with a photographic memory, collecting information and filing it away for future use. At 2:00, I made my move. "Excuse me, everyone," I said, raising my voice to carry across the gathered crowd. "I have something I'd like to share." Conversations stopped. Faces turned toward me. Jenna went pale. "I wanted to thank you all for being such good neighbors over the years. Even though I'm not living on Orchard Lane anymore, this community will always be special to me." Murmurs of sympathy and support rippled through the crowd. Several people nodded approvingly. I also wanted to clear up some misunderstandings that have been going around about why my marriage ended and what really happened. Now I had everyone's attention. Even the children had stopped playing. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. See, I've learned some interesting things lately. Things I think you should all know about. Eli, don't, Jenna said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I was already opening the envelope, pulling out the photographs Tommy had taken. Clear, undeniable images of Tanya entering pawn shops, of CJ driving her around town, of both of them engaged in activities that had nothing to do with job hunting or innocent errands. These were taken last week, I announced, holding up the first photograph. That's my sister-in-law Tanya selling stolen property, and that's Craig Jeffries helping her do it. Gasps and exclamations erupted from the crowd. CJ lunged toward me, but I stepped aside, letting him stumble into Mrs. Patterson's folding chair. The items she's selling belong to me, I continued, my voice carrying clearly in the crisp air. Tools, equipment, personal belongings taken from my house without permission. You're lying, Tanya's voice came from the front porch, where she'd appeared like a malevolent fairy. He's making this up because he's bitter about the divorce. Am I? I pulled out more photographs, more documentation. Here's the receipt from Murphy's pawn shop. Here's a copy of the lease agreement you and CJ signed for an apartment in Portland. Here's a police report I filed yesterday morning. The crowd was silent now, everyone staring at the evidence in my hands. Jenna looked like she was going to be sick. There's more, I said, reaching into the envelope one last time. Shane Morrison, that's Tanya's boyfriend, has been asking questions about security at Pinnacle Manufacturing. Specifically, he's been interested in employee records and access codes. I looked directly at CJ. The kind of information someone in HR might have access to. That's when CJ finally snapped. He charged at me again, this time with real intent, but I was ready for him. I stepped aside and let his momentum carry him past me, then stuck out my foot. He went down hard, landing face first in Mrs. Dwyer's potato salad. The crowd erupted. Some people laughed, others gasped, and a few started taking pictures with their phones. CJ struggled to his feet, potato salad dripping from his face, looking like the fool he'd always been. This is all lies, he sputtered. He can't prove any of this. Actually, I can. I held up a small digital device. This is a voice recorder I left in my basement workshop. It's been recording conversations for the past month. I pressed play, and Tanya's voice filled the air, clear and damning. The security codes change every 2 weeks, but Jenna can get the new ones. Shane says the payroll files are worth at least $50,000 on the black market. We just need to wait until Eli's completely out of the picture. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, all at once, everyone started talking. Neighbors turned to each other, voices rising in shock and outrage. Someone mentioned calling the police. Tanya tried to run, but Mrs. Dwyer's grandson, a college football player built like a refrigerator, blocked her path. CJ was still wiping potato salad from his eyes, looking around desperately for an escape route that didn't exist. And Jenna? Jenna just stood there, tears streaming down her face, finally understanding the full scope of what her sister had dragged her into. I didn't know, she whispered, but her words were lost in the chaos. I walked over to her, close enough that only she could hear me. Yes, you did, I said quietly. Maybe not all of it, but enough. You knew Tanya was stealing. You knew CJ was married. You knew I didn't deserve what you did to me. She looked up at me, mascara running down her cheeks. What happens now? Now you face the consequences. Police sirens were already wailing in the distance, growing closer. Someone had called them. Probably Mrs. Dwyer, who never missed an opportunity to be helpful. I stepped back and surveyed the scene. CJ covered in potato salad and shame. Tanya held firmly by a college kid who looked like he was enjoying himself, Jenna crying in her yellow dress while neighbors whispered and pointed. It was perfect. I walked to my truck, climbed in, and drove away from Orchard Lane for the last time. In my rearview mirror, I could see the police cars arriving, their red and blue lights painting the perfect autumn day in colors of justice and consequence. My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it while stopped at a red light. It was from Jimmy. Heard there was some excitement at the block party. You okay? I typed back, never better. And for the first time in months, that was absolutely true. The last house on Orchard Lane was behind me now, along with everything it represented. Betrayal, lies, and the kind of small-town drama that destroyed lives and reputations with equal efficiency. I had a new apartment, steady work, and the satisfaction of knowing that justice, while sometimes delayed, was never truly denied. The road ahead was empty and full of possibilities. I drove toward it without looking back.